Imagine yourself seated in a vast conference room where the overhead lights reflect off a polished wooden table so intensely you can see every trace of exhaustion etched on your own face. Suddenly, the person across from you, a new executive in a stylish suit who loves to spew flowery slogans about business spirit, casually slides a stack of termination papers your way, explaining that the company needs hungrier talent, even though you single-handedly brought in nearly 40% of its revenue. At 46 years old, after 9 years at Athenia Corp in Riverfield City, Darius McAllister has built an invaluable network of clients through personal relationships, endless business trips, and countless late nights. Yet now, it seems all those contributions mean nothing when Brandon Elroy, a vice president of sales who joined just 6 months ago, declares the company wants to head in a more innovative direction and that apparently leaves no room for someone they deem outdated. In that instant, Darius feels not only the sting of injustice, but also a strong sense that they're making a colossal mistake, and whatever's coming next could surpass everything anyone in that room ever imagined. If you're curious how Darius will confront and overcome this unexpected blow, be sure to follow the story. Subscribe now so you don't miss the upcoming twists where the tension will rise to staggering heights. Darius McAllister had never envisioned himself as a mere cog in someone else's corporate machine, yet for 9 years at Athenia Corp in Riverfield City, he poured every ounce of his energy into building something that felt more like his own legacy than an ordinary job. He started out modestly, handling a handful of regional clients who had little reason to trust an ambitious newcomer. But he soon discovered that genuine relationships, the ones forged through face-to-face dinners, long phone calls, and even attending the occasional family barbecue, had a way of creating business opportunities that no glossy brochure or sterile Zoom pitch could match. Over the span of almost a decade, Darius methodically expanded Athenia Corp's client portfolio from local retailers to major national accounts. And as each contract renewed and each new agreement was signed, his sense of ownership grew stronger. It was never just about profit. It was also about the pride he felt, knowing that his word carried weight in boardrooms, that his handshake actually meant something, and that clients saw him not as a vendor but as a partner, worth trusting with multi-million-dollar deals. He vividly recalled those early years when he would drive across 3 states in the span of one weekend to attend client events, often missing out on his daughter's dance recitals or the casual Sunday barbecues at his parents' house. The family always joked that Darius's second home was the interstate, and to some extent, that was the truth. He spent more time in hotel lobbies and airport terminals than he did in his own living room. Yet he took pride in it, because every long drive or red-eye flight was another building block in his reputation for reliability. So when people marveled at the fact that Darius's accounts were pulling in nearly 40% of the company's overall revenue, he would only smile and shrug, insisting it came down to consistent follow-up calls, personal touch, and that odd willingness to pick up the phone at 2 a.m. when a client on the West Coast panicked about a contract detail. However, around 6 months ago, the landscape began shifting in ways that seemed subtle at first, but gradually became undeniable. It started with a casual departmental announcement that the sales force would be realigned under a newly appointed vice president, a man named Brandon Elroy, who arrived wrapped in an aura of corporate ambition that was as sharp as his tailored suits. On the surface, Brandon was the epitome of modern business leadership, preaching transformation through motivational soundbites and pep rallies that promised a bold future for Athenia Corp. Yet, for all his talk of unity, Darius noticed a distinct lack of interest in actually meeting the existing clients, or even consulting with the seasoned team members who had nurtured those accounts through countless ups and downs. Then came the reorganization of their physical workspace. Darius's large, window-lined desk, once placed near the center of activity, was quietly shuffled to a corner area under the guise of making room for new hires, and soon enough, that corner started to feel oddly isolated, as though he were being sidelined instead of recognized for his accomplishments. The little signs piled up quickly. Darius's name was unexpectedly dropped from several meeting invites, that he had always attended, especially those involving high-profile contracts. He closed himself. When he asked about it, the standard explanation was that scheduling conflicts or new strategic focuses warranted a leaner roster, which conveniently omitted him. He also noticed that Brandon often insisted on new voices taking the lead in negotiations, including junior staff who barely understood how to handle intricate contract clauses or the long-standing relationships Darius had spent years cultivating. He tried to brush it off at first, reassuring himself that maybe the company was simply embracing fresh ideas, but deep down, a knot of unease began to form. It was as if the ground beneath his feet was shifting, little by little, and he feared that one day it might collapse entirely. Matters worsened when the commission structure was abruptly revamped. Ostensibly, the goal was to reward growth in emerging markets, which sounded forward, thinking until the spreadsheets arrived showing that Darius's existing revenue, despite being the single largest chunk of Athenia Corp's income stream, would yield significantly lower personal earnings. Though it was framed as a temporary adjustment, he suspected that the real intention was to drive him toward chasing fresh prospects instead of investing more time nurturing established clients. If that had been the entire plan, Darius might have swallowed his frustration and adapted, but there were more ominous hints lurking in the background. His assistants, once crucial to coordinating his hectic travel schedule and client follow-ups, were gradually reassigned to other teams. His expense reports, previously handled with routine efficiency, started coming back with lengthy interrogations over minor charges, as though the finance department was hunting for any excuse to discredit him. IT staff popped by to check on his computer while he was out to lunch, and each time, he returned to find his desktop rearranged or certain software mysteriously uninstalled. All the while, Brandon delivered weekly pep talks about disruption and innovative thinking, inviting a flurry of newly hired MBAs into the fold. Young, brash employees who arrived with impressive resumes but minimal knowledge of Athenia Corp's history or the nuanced challenges of the industries they were stepping into. It wasn't that Darius opposed fresh blood. In fact, he often appreciated an inspired approach that challenged the status quo. Yet, something in Brandon's method felt less like a genuine quest for innovation and more like a stealthy operation to undercut the existing power structure. A suspicion that gnawed at Darius whenever he spotted Brandon whispering in hushed tones with the new recruits. One Friday evening, while finishing some last-minute paperwork, Darius paused to look around the nearly deserted sales floor. It struck him how the once bustling atmosphere where colleagues traded jokes and tips on how to handle tough clients had dulled into a cautious, almost suspicious silence, with everyone half wondering if they were next on Brandon's hidden agenda. A junior salesperson who used to consult Darius on how to handle big negotiations no longer came by. An older colleague who had once jokingly referred to Darius as the cornerstone of this place was now avoiding eye contact altogether, perhaps sensing that aligning with him might not be the safest career move. Despite these growing tensions, Darius clung to the belief that results mattered more than office politics. After all, he still had numbers that dwarfed anyone else's performance, even with the commission cuts and minimized resources. He reasoned that as long as his accounts were thriving, it wouldn't make sense for Athenia Corp to push him out. Yet, in the back of his mind, a nagging thought persisted. What if this isn't about numbers at all? He recalled an offhand comment Brandon made in a meeting about company-owned relationships, stressing that no single individual should hold all the client loyalty. It dawned on Darius that perhaps the very strength of his client network, those deeply personal ties that made him indispensable, could be interpreted as a threat to any plan aiming to centralize control or reshape the client management model. If he were too integral, the company might worry about losing their most profitable accounts the instant Darius chose to walk away. That fear could drive them to preemptively weaken his position or replace him with a less established figure who would be more compliant with corporate directives. Late one evening, as he prepared to head home, Darius gathered up a few personal belongings, a photo of his daughter from her high school graduation, an old thank you note a grateful client had written, and a small sculpture he picked up during a sales trip to Japan years ago. The sense of foreboding returned, heavier than ever. The journey that spanned 9 years, born of long hours and relentless dedication, was beginning to resemble a tower built on unstable ground. He looked around the silent office and felt an unsettling blend of nostalgia and apprehension, aware that, despite everything he'd contributed, his status here was no longer unquestionable. Something significant was on the horizon, and with each passing day, the subtle cracks in Athenia Corp's facade became clearer. Whether it was a restructuring, a power grab, or something even bigger, he knew he was on borrowed time, and that understanding wrapped itself around him like a persistent chill. Still, Darius resolved not to let fear dictate his next steps, for he believed that truth and real business value would always rise to the surface in the end. All he needed was to keep his eyes open and be ready for whatever came next. Darius McAllister entered the conference room that morning with a lingering sense of unease. Yet he still clung to the hope that whatever meeting had been abruptly scheduled might be related to a contract negotiation or a shift in client strategy. However, from the moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere felt off. Brandon Elroy, typically brimming with corporate enthusiasm, was seated at the far end of a lengthy mahogany table, eyes fixed intently on a stack of documents in front of him. 2 other managers, who rarely attended meetings with Darius directly, sat quietly along the side, their postures stiff and their faces pale. The large blinds on the windows had been drawn, casting the room in a muted, almost somber light that accentuated the tension. Darius could taste the anxiety in the air as he took a seat, unsure of what awaited him, yet fearing it was something far worse than a simple policy announcement. Without even offering a polite greeting or a preamble about team synergy, Brandon cleared his throat and stated in a flat, businesslike tone that Athenia Corp was heading in a new direction. He then slid the papers across the table with the sort of casual efficiency one might use when passing a restaurant check. "We need hungrier talent who can meet higher targets," he said, as though reading from a script someone else had written for him. Darius glanced down at the top page, realizing within seconds that he was holding his own termination paperwork, complete with clauses about severance and the immediate end to all his responsibilities. It felt surreal that after 9 years of being the company's top performer, he was now facing a coldly worded document that declared his skills and contributions irrelevant. The rationale Brandon presented bordered on the absurd, especially in light of Darius's well-documented achievements. He was told that his style of managing existing accounts no longer aligned with the company's need for aggressive expansion, and that his performance metrics had stagnated. Darius found it nearly comical, because the spreadsheet he had reviewed just last week showed his portfolio alone bringing in nearly 40% of Athenia Corp's overall revenue, dwarfing the combined efforts of multiple other account teams. Yet Brandon soldiered on with his speech, enumerating cliches about innovation, energetic new blood, and the necessity of shaking up the old guard. It was as if the VP of sales believed that reiterating those buzzwords enough times would make the actual facts magically disappear. The other managers, looking every bit like unwilling accomplices, simply watched without uttering a word of dissent, allowing Brandon's scripted excuses to dominate the conversation. A swirl of conflicting emotions coursed through Darius's mind as he listened. On one hand, disbelief consumed him. How could the same company that had showered him with praise and awards, even featuring his success stories in internal newsletters, abruptly decide his contributions no longer mattered? On the other hand, he felt a growing sense of clarity that the events of the past few months, all those little signals and inconveniences, had been guiding him toward this exact moment. They had slowly eroded his standing in the company, moving his desk to an isolated corner, removing him from crucial meetings, questioning his expense reports, and hinting that his methods were too traditional for the new direction. In hindsight, every step seemed orchestrated to undermine his importance, so that when the final blow landed, it would appear inevitable. Yet as Brandon wrapped up his spiel and reached for a pen to sign his portion of the termination file, Darius felt his frustration transform into something unexpected, a startling calm, tinged with a faint glimmer of vindication. The meeting, for all its humiliating spectacle, validated every suspicion he had harbored about an underlying scheme. He realized that the moment he walked out of that room, the company's leadership, particularly Brandon, would be forced to face the ramifications of losing the very person who had maintained the bulk of their client relationships. Darius had poured nearly a decade into fostering deep trust with major corporations, forging connections that were personal as much as they were professional. Those clients relied on him as a steady hand, a dependable advisor, the person they called for anything from renegotiations to last-minute contract amendments. By choosing to let him go, the company was effectively cutting the bridge to clients who had built a business relationship with Darius rather than with a faceless entity named Athenia Corp. The absurd reasoning made Darius want to speak up, to lay out in clear terms just how disastrous this move could become, but he held his tongue. He could see that Brandon was already uneasy beneath the calm veneer, even in the short half-hour this meeting had taken. It seemed Brandon understood the risk of the firing, but was too invested in his own agenda to admit it. The two managers seated to the side exchanged nervous glances, perhaps wondering if they should intervene, but no one dared challenge Brandon in front of Darius. Silence, thick and suffocating, lingered in the room as Darius quietly signed where he was told, resisting the urge to argue for a job he no longer wanted. He had always believed a person's worth couldn't be captured by a single decision from corporate higher-ups, but in that moment, watching the ink dry on those termination papers, he felt a pang of betrayal mingled with a growing resolve. When it was over, Brandon stood as if to guide him out, but Darius calmly reached for the folder containing his copies of the documents, gathered his briefcase, and strode toward the door without accepting the parting handshake Brandon offered. "Thank you for the opportunity," Darius said, his tone polite yet laced with a quiet conviction that made Brandon pause. As soon as Darius stepped into the corridor, he caught sight of a few coworkers who had obviously been hovering nearby, hoping to glean some insight into what was happening behind closed doors. Expressions of shock, pity, and fear flashed across their faces. Darius didn't linger to explain. He simply walked to the elevator, each step resonating with the knowledge that this corporate building where he had spent countless hours sealing deals worth millions was no longer a place that valued him. Inside the elevator, the reality of the situation finally hit him, although not with the overwhelming panic one might expect. Instead, a sense of clarity emerged. Something monumental had just ended, and with that ending came the possibility of a new beginning he had never considered before. The hiss of the elevator doors opening on the ground floor felt strangely liberating, like stepping out into a future where he was no longer tethered to a structure that seemed determined to undercut him. Still clutching the papers in one hand, Darius headed to the parking garage, where he silently placed a small cardboard box packed with nearly a decade's worth of photos, personal mementos, and a contact folder he had meticulously maintained onto the passenger seat. In that moment, he allowed a sliver of confidence to take root, because if Athenia Corp believed it could flourish without the person who had fueled almost half of its revenue, then perhaps it was time to see exactly who would be proven right in the end. Darius McAllister awoke the next morning with an unsettling clarity, the echoes of the previous day's termination meeting still reverberating in his mind, yet he refused to let the weight of that betrayal crush him. Instead, he felt a calm resolve that guided his first actions after stepping out of bed, as he gathered a small notebook where he had meticulously documented the personal contact numbers of his top clients, the very people who had contributed to Athenia Corp's success for so many years. With a resigned sigh, he realized he could no longer represent a company that had dismissed him so carelessly, though part of him also knew that these well-established relationships he had spent nearly a decade nurturing deserved honesty from him, rather than the cold shock of finding out his departure through some impersonal memo. He walked to his kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee that felt heavier than usual, and mentally rehearsed how to break the news without seeming bitter or desperate for sympathy. Still in his pajamas, he took a seat at the small breakfast table by the window, the faint morning light outlining his tense shoulders, and began placing calls to the people he trusted most. The long-term clients who had grown from being mere business partners to something more akin to personal friends. The first call was to Clark Jennings, CEO of a major logistics firm that had relied on Darius to smooth out endless contractual hurdles over the years. After 2 rings, Clark picked up. Sounding jovial at first, had no idea of the corporate upheaval that had taken place. When Darius calmly explained that he was no longer affiliated with Athenia Corp and wanted to inform Clark personally before any rumors reached him, there was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. Clark asked for details, pressing to know whether Darius had left by choice or if something dire had occurred behind the scenes. Darius opted for discretion, explaining succinctly that Athenia had chosen a new direction, and he didn't fit the narrative they were trying to build, which left Clark audibly concerned but also surprisingly resolute in his support. "You've always been our linchpin, Darius," Clark said with a hint of urgency, "so I'm not sure how Athenia expects us to handle an account of our size without you." That conversation set the tone for the calls to come, each one revealing the same mixture of disbelief and frustration from clients who had been under the impression that Athenia's service was inseparable from Darius's dependable guidance. Next, he dialed Helen Maxwell, whose real estate conglomerate had grown exponentially with his assistance in securing favorable financing terms and strategic partnerships across state lines. She responded with an almost motherly concern, asking if Darius was all right, if he needed anything, and if this was truly Athenia's final decision. He reassured her that it was indeed final, and he found himself feeling strangely uplifted by her heartfelt response, though he didn't seek pity. It felt good to know someone valued his contributions enough to be genuinely worried. By the time he hung up, Helen had subtly implied that if he landed somewhere else soon, she might be more than willing to transfer her entire portfolio to his new professional Homean offer. He acknowledged with gratitude, but also careful restraint, since he had no desire to spark accusations of poaching or malicious intent. The more calls he made, the more confident he grew that Athenia's leadership had vastly underestimated the personal bonds woven between him and these clients. Almost every conversation concluded with the same vow of loyalty toward Darius, rather than the corporate brand, and while he consistently refrained from soliciting any sort of immediate commitment, he could hear in their voices the deep unease about entrusting their accounts to someone like Brandon Elroy who, by all appearances, had never shown the slightest interest in understanding their individual needs. By late morning, Darius's phone was buzzing incessantly, some calls coming from clients he hadn't even contacted yet, who had evidently heard the news through the industry's inevitable grapevine. One by one, they asked him for clarity, anxious about who would handle their contracts, their expansions, their unique challenges. He spoke with an even, measured tone, telling them only that he was no longer with Athenia and that the choice of how to proceed rested solely in their hands. While he didn't admit it out loud, Darius felt a spark of vindication each time he heard the shock and disapproval in their voices, for it validated his sense that Athenia Corp's callous decision was destined to backfire in a spectacular way. He pictured Brandon Elroy pacing in his office, fielding frantic messages from the legal department or from upper management, struggling to answer panicked questions about why one of the most profitable account executives had been cast aside. Darius could almost imagine the scowls on the faces of the board members who might have supported Brandon's shakeup, not realizing the extent to which Darius served as the relational glue binding clients to Athenia's services. It was a subtle sort of revenge, one that he didn't have to orchestrate actively, he only needed to inform people of the truth. By the time he finally stepped away from his phone, well past noon, he had lost count of how many clients he'd spoken to. The coffee in his mug had grown cold, and his back ached from leaning over the table, but a sense of liberation flooded through him as he realized there was no longer any confusion about where he stood in relation to Athenia Corp. He might have walked out of their glass-walled skyscraper without a job, but he retained something far more vital: the respect and trust of individuals who believed in him more than any corporate slogan or flashy sales pitch. Reflecting on the morning's whirlwind of calls, Darius understood that this was not simply damage control. This was the beginning of a new path he would forge, free from a company that had never truly valued his expertise. He was done acting as a loyal guardian to a place that had cast him aside, and though he didn't know exactly where he would land, he felt the comforting assurance that he wouldn't have to face the next challenge alone. Athenia Corp had laid the groundwork for its own downfall by alienating the very man who had elevated its name to begin with, and now Darius knew he was standing on the edge of a turning point that could change everything for him and for anyone wise enough to follow. In the days following his abrupt departure, Darius McAllister found himself sifting through myriad clues that all seemed to point to something much larger than mere office politics or a new vice president's vendetta. He had already known that Athenia Corp's upper management wanted to rebrand the company's sales approach, hiring those young disruptors and talking incessantly about fresh perspectives. But the more he replayed recent events in his mind, the more he sensed there had to be a deeper motive for pushing him out, especially given the sizable revenue stream he'd overseen. A phone call from Julia Spencer, his former executive assistant who'd been reassigned weeks before his firing, finally tore away the veil of secrecy he'd been struggling to understand. Speaking in a hushed voice to avoid being overheard at the office, Julia admitted she had stumbled upon a series of emails and memos discussing an imminent acquisition deal. Evidently, Athenia Corp had caught the attention of a private equity firm called Viridian Capital, which was interested in purchasing the company on the condition that the major client relationships be shifted away from any single individual and neatly packaged as corporate-owned assets. Hearing Julia's confession, Darius felt a swirl of both vindication and anger, as if two storm fronts converged violently in his chest. He recalled how, not long after Brandon Elroy arrived, the talk in internal meetings had frequently pivoted to the topic of standardizing client management, with repeated assurances that such standardization would make the company more attractive to strategic partners. He had never imagined that the endgame involved a full-scale buyout, let alone an elaborate plan to sideline him so that Viridian Capital wouldn't worry about one-star account executive holding too much leverage. It was as though every small indignity, his desk being moved, his expense reports questioned, the reworked commission structure, had all been part of a larger tapestry of calculated moves to undercut his significance in the eyes of potential buyers. By reducing his influence and scattering his responsibilities among newer hires, Athenia Corp could argue that their most profitable clients were loyal to the brand, not to a single man named Darius McAllister. Julia whispered that the deal was initially scheduled to wrap up by the following quarter, with Brandon at the helm managing the transition of those high-revenue accounts. However, it seemed no one in the executive suite had anticipated that Darius's termination would trigger such an immediate and powerful reaction from clients. According to the files Julia saw, Viridian Capital's due diligence relied heavily on forecasts that assumed zero attrition from Darius's portfolio. The private equity firm believed it was tapping into a stable revenue stream that could be integrated seamlessly with its existing portfolio companies. But now, in light of Darius's sudden exit and the resulting wave of client uncertainty, the entire deal stood on precarious ground. Julia confided that the top brass were in panic mode behind closed doors, frantically trying to reassure Viridian Capital that they could salvage the situation by offering swift discounts, hosting new face-to-face introductions, and unveiling a next-generation client engagement plan that would somehow replicate the trust Darius had spent 9 years building. While pacing in his living room, phone pressed to his ear, Darius listened with a grim, somber satisfaction. He felt personally betrayed that an organization he had helped transform into a respected name had effectively orchestrated his downfall just to appear more lucrative in the eyes of potential buyers. Yet he was also acutely aware that Athenia Corp's plan was unraveling faster than they could contain it, and he couldn't help but appreciate the irony. After all, it was his very ability to connect with people, his skill at forging genuine, long-lasting relationships, that made Athenia Corp so valuable in the first place. And in discarding him, they had effectively severed the lifeblood of that value. "They shouldn't have underestimated you," Julia remarked quietly, before ending the call in a rush to avoid suspicion, leaving Darius standing amid the silent weight of this newfound knowledge. Later that evening, as he mulled over the situation with a quiet sense of outrage, Darius found himself recalling scattered interactions that suddenly took on new meaning. He remembered a casual visit from an individual introduced to him as a strategic advisor a few weeks back, someone who appeared overly keen on reviewing the finer details of contract terms for key clients. At the time, Darius chalked it up to the usual corporate routine of outsiders trying to align strategies. But now he realized that visitor was likely a representative from Viridian Capital, studying the logistics of how to sever Darius from the accounts, or how to reassure the firm's investors that Darius's role could be replicated or scaled. It was a calculated move to gauge whether Athenia's top clients were loyal to the brand or loyal to the man they had come to trust over nearly a decade. That memory now stung with the bitter taste of betrayal. The next morning, he received a text from one of his former co-workers, a mid-level manager who had stayed behind. It read, "Brandon's in meltdown mode. They're holding emergency meetings to control client fallout." The words ignited a flicker of grim satisfaction in Darius's chest, though he tried to remain focused on his own future rather than dwelling on the company's unraveling plans. He knew that for Athenia Corp, losing clients at this stage wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a catastrophic blow to the very premise of the pending sale. If the acquisitions team at Viridian Capital sensed that the company's client base could fall apart without Darius's presence, the agreed-upon valuation might dissolve in a matter of days. He envisioned the frantic calls and emails, the damage control spiraling through every layer of the executive team, and for the first time in recent memory, he felt a surge of validation that overcame the lingering sting of being fired. Determined to confirm Julia's revelations, Darius reached out to a few trusted industry contacts, people who had gleaned bits and pieces of mergers and acquisitions, chatter circulating through the financial circles of Riverfield City. Sure enough, they corroborated the rumor that Viridian Capital had set its sights on Athenia Corp as a stepping stone for a larger expansion plan. The entire strategy hinged on showcasing stable, well-managed revenue streams that could be consolidated under Viridian's brand. And the fastest way to ensure that was to minimize the influence of individuals like Darius, whose strong personal connections were viewed as a liability. The swift and silent purge of his influence, orchestrated by Brandon and tacitly approved by the board, was designed to assure Viridian Capital that Athenia was safe to acquire, without worrying about a mass client exodus if one key person resigned or asked for better terms. Armed with the truth, Darius's sense of purpose crystallized. He no longer felt obligated to bite his tongue or wonder if he had been at fault. Instead, he recognized that the company had put short-term profit from a buyout over the foundational relationships that had fueled its growth in the first place. A simmering anger mingled with a fierce determination to make sure his clients and anyone else caught in Athenia Corp's illusions understood how their trust had been betrayed. He didn't have to wage an overt war supply. Maintaining his integrity and allowing the facts to surface would do the job far better than any scorched earth tactic. He was confident that the truth, now out in the open, would dismantle Athenia's carefully curated facade, one exposed detail at a time. And in that certainty, he found both an unspoken revenge and the promise of a new beginning, one that belonged entirely to him, unshackled from a company that never deserved his loyalty in the first place. In the weeks that followed, the shock waves of Darius McAllister's departure reverberated through every corridor of Athenia Corp, as though the very foundation of the company had been shaken loose. At first, there was an air of forced optimism emanating from the executive suite, where Brandon Elroy and his close associates insisted they could contain the fallout by offering temporary discounts and scheduling urgent meetings with unsettled clients. However, these stopgap measures proved laughably insufficient against the groundswell of unrest that spread once word got out that Athenia's most trusted account executive had been cast aside. Clients who had previously remained on the fence began questioning the logic of renewing contracts with a firm whose leadership seemed both capricious and disingenuous. Rumors circulated that the private equity group Viridian Capital was now actively reconsidering its acquisition offer, unsettled by the very prospect of acquiring a company that had allowed personal relationships and the revenue tied to them to slip through its fingers so carelessly. Before long, the once confident atmosphere around Brandon started to crumble, and the team he had cobbled together, composed of fresh hires unfamiliar with Athenia Corp's legacy clients, found themselves out of their depth. They scrambled to retain accounts that had been loyal to Darius for years, repeatedly promising a seamless transition, even as those same clients reported bungled follow-ups and inexperienced junior reps who didn't grasp the complexities of their businesses. Brandon, in a desperate move to calm the growing crisis, convened a series of high-pressure sales pep talks, urging the staff to emulate Darius's approach without ever admitting they had dismantled the very framework that made Darius so effective. Insiders whispered about late-night meetings where Brandon's frustration boiled over, resulting in shouting matches with various department heads who questioned his methods. No matter how many times he repeated buzzwords like synergy and innovation, there was no denying the glaring reality. Revenue streams were drying up, top-tier clients were exploring alternatives, and the proud image Athenia had cultivated over the years was now irreparably tarnished. Meanwhile, the rest of the executive leadership, including CEO Elliot Sterling, had no choice but to confront the board of directors with the grim truth that the domino effect of Darius's termination might jeopardize the Viridian Capital deal entirely. Their carefully laid plans for a lucrative buyout hinged on a client portfolio that would remain robust despite personnel changes. Yet the departure of key accounts exposed the fragility of any valuation that presumed continuity. Reports began to filter back that Viridian Capital's analysts were revising their offer downward or backing away, altogether citing increased uncertainty in client loyalty as a core reason. Behind closed doors, Elliot Sterling wrestled with the weight of that failed strategy, realizing that in greenlighting Brandon's effort to strip Darius of his influence, he had unwittingly set the stage for Athenia's undoing. Panic set in as the board demanded answers to questions that no one, least of all Brandon, seemed able to provide. Why did Athenia disregard the warning signs when Darius first raised concerns about the shifting internal culture? How could they have miscalculated the strength of the relationships he maintained, believing that new hires would effortlessly fill his shoes? Each frantic step they took, whether it was firing off retention packages to disillusioned clients or deploying newly minted account managers to apologize for recent misunderstandings, only seemed to heighten the perception that Athenia was floundering without Darius's steady hand. Internal memos leaked, revealing the extent of the company's desperation. One email showed Brandon instructing subordinates to offer whatever discount necessary to retain certain accounts, effectively disregarding profitability in a last-ditch attempt to stave off a mass exodus. As the turmoil escalated, the internal blame game began in earnest. Lower-level employees, who had witnessed Darius's pivotal role in sustaining those major contracts, expressed frustration that their warnings were ignored when Brandon first took over. Mid-level managers, caught between Brandon's unrealistic directives and a tidal wave of client dissatisfaction, started forwarding complaints up the chain of command with increasingly urgent language. Even some board members, who once championed Brandon's supposedly forward-thinking approach, now distanced themselves from his policies, speaking privately about the catastrophic misjudgment that had allowed personal agendas to overshadow the company's best interests. Eventually, Brandon Elroy found himself cornered, unable to mask his failure. In a tense executive session, members of the board confronted him with the stark figures: an alarming drop in contract renewals, a precipitous decline in quarterly revenue, and the likelihood that Viridian Capital would no longer pursue the acquisition. Though he attempted to shift blame, suggesting that Darius's exit had been orchestrated to sabotage Athenia from within, his arguments rang hollow. The board could plainly see that it was Brandon who had convinced them to push Darius out in the first place, and it was Brandon who had assured them of a seamless transition that never materialized. With the CEO's credibility also hanging in the balance, Elliot Sterling reluctantly announced a restructuring plan that effectively removed Brandon from his role, spinning the news in a perfunctory press release that claimed he was exploring new opportunities outside the company. Insiders knew better. His downfall was merely the culmination of a failed gambit that had hinged on discrediting one man whose departure proved devastating. Soon after Brandon's departure, Elliot Sterling stepped forward to shoulder his portion of the blame, publicly acknowledging that Athenia Corp had misjudged the significance of certain key personnel. However, the statement was far too late to repair the damage. The company's once glittering reputation had dimmed. Prospective clients were wary of entrusting their business to a firm that had demonstrated such a lack of foresight, and the internal team morale sank to new lows as staff wondered whether more cuts or reorganizations were imminent. Shareholders demanded accountability for a value that had plummeted nearly overnight, and the newly assembled Crisis Management Committee found itself drowning in negative coverage from trade publications and local business journals. By the time the final quarter closed, Athenia Corp's meltdown was plain for all to see. Major clients had fled, lured away by competitors who pointed out that Darius McAllister, an industry heavyweight, was no longer at Athenia, which made them question the reliability of any remaining long-term contracts. The main office in Riverfield City, once a buzzing hive of ambitious professionals, took on the hushed air of a space haunted by miscalculation and regret. In the end, while Elliot Sterling managed to hold on to his CEO title for a short time, the writing was on the wall. A broad leadership overhaul was inevitable, and the company's best hope was to pick up the pieces and restructure with an entirely new strategy that, ironically, looked much like the client-centric model Darius had championed all along. Amid this unraveling, one undeniable fact stood out. By underestimating Darius and dismissing his decades of accrued trust with clients, Athenia Corp had practically orchestrated its own downfall, revealing just how fragile success can be when loyalty and authenticity are stripped away in the pursuit of a quick corporate gain. In the wake of Athenia Corp's implosion, Darius McAllister allowed himself only a brief moment of satisfaction before turning his attention to the future, uncertain yet brimming with untapped possibilities. One afternoon, as he sat in his living room surrounded by the tangible remnants of his 9-year commitment awards, client thank you notes, and scribbled meeting agendas, his phone rang. On the other end was Marissa Grant, a key figure at Grantley Associates, a smaller but highly respected financial services firm based just outside Riverfield City. She spoke in a tone that struck a careful balance between admiration and curiosity, explaining that her colleagues had already heard whispers about Darius's split from Athenia and were keen to discuss how he might help them expand their reach. At first, he felt a twinge of skepticism, wondering if this was another company poised to exploit his network. Yet, as Marissa elaborated on Grantley's philosophy of placing genuine relationships at the heart of every business deal, something inside Darius softened, stirring a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, he had found the kind of environment he had once believed Athenia to be. He accepted an invitation to tour Grantley's main office, a modern, sunlit space filled with a hum of collaborative energy that contrasted sharply with Athenia's tense corridors. Rather than putting him through a gauntlet of impersonal interviews, Marissa and 2 senior partners hosted a roundtable discussion, eager to hear Darius's ideas about how to forge authentic client bonds in a marketplace increasingly dominated by automated systems and churn-and-burn sales methods. They asked about his experiences at Athenia, carefully steering clear of prying into sensitive details, and they displayed genuine interest in the integrity of the processes he had cultivated over nearly a decade of long-haul success. By the end of that meeting, Darius was struck by how different Grantley felt. There were no contrived motivational slogans, no fast-track illusions that belittled seasoned professionals in favor of flashy newcomers, and no vibe of one-upmanship swirling in the conference room. Instead, he found himself speaking openly, describing the countless ways he had nurtured client confidence at Athenia, and for the first time in months, he sensed that those words were actually resonating rather than being dismissed as archaic relationship farming. The formal offer arrived in his inbox just a day later, although the real excitement came from a phone call directly from Henry Grantley, the firm's founder. Henry explained that they were prepared to welcome Darius at a senior executive level, offering a generous salary alongside an ownership stake that reflected the value of the relationships he would bring. While Henry made it clear he hoped Darius's old clients would follow him, there was no coercive language, no ultimatum about demands or timelines. Grantley simply promised that if Darius joined them, he would have the autonomy and resources he needed to support each client as meticulously as he had done before. Backed by a firm that respected the power of genuine human connection, the role included oversight of a specialized team of analysts and account managers, allowing Darius to replicate and possibly even enhance the personalized service model he had once perfected under Athenia's banner. Over the next few days, he debated internally, a swirl of pride and hesitation coursing through him as he recalled the painful betrayal he had endured. But the memory of how swiftly Athenia had cast him aside, paired with the promise of a fresh start, finally swayed him, and he signed on with Grantley Associates before the week was out. From the moment he stepped into his new office, which boasted a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Riverfield City's skyline, everything felt different. He greeted his newly assembled team, some old acquaintances in the industry, some fresh faces eager to learn, and found himself energized by their collaborative spirit. Grantley fulfilled its pledge almost immediately. Darius was handed wide latitude to negotiate contracts, introduce innovative client outreach initiatives, and shape policy decisions that recognize the nuance of building long-term trust. The first couple of weeks were a blur of phone calls from clients who had heard through the grapevine that he'd resurfaced, leading to a cascade of contract signings. However, Darius was careful not to push anyone. He simply offered the same consistent support they had come to expect. And clients naturally gravitated toward the firm that valued Darius's expertise as much as they valued the revenue. Within 2 months, Grantley was inking deals that it previously might never have dared to pursue, and Darius found himself immersed in the kind of success that wasn't merely about numbers on a balance sheet, but about personal vindication. Each agreement felt like another chapter of redemption, proving that authenticity and relationship building were not just quaint relics, but the beating heart of sustainable business growth. One afternoon, while reviewing quarterly performance metrics, Darius paused to reflect on the spectacular contrast between how he had once felt stifled at Athenia and how, at Grantley, he finally felt free to do the work he believed in. The new environment also gave him more control over his personal schedule, allowing him to reclaim the parts of life he had missed, like attending his daughter's dance recital, without glancing anxiously at his phone every 5 minutes. Colleagues often remarked on the shift in his demeanor, noting that the guarded tension he had carried after leaving Athenia had gradually been replaced by a confident, almost enthusiastic air that lifted the entire floor's morale. In staff meetings, he made a point of recognizing individual efforts and sharing the successes with the broader team, planting seeds of trust that spread through the organization. Far from feeling threatened by a rising star, the partners at Grantley seemed relieved to have someone championing the same values they had preached but struggled to fully implement. As each new contract was finalized, they toasted the achievement not just with a perfunctory email announcement but with small, meaningful celebrations that reminded everyone of the humanity behind the deals. Within 6 months, Grantley Associates had grown by an astonishing margin. not only through Darius's existing clients, but also because word began to travel that this up-and-coming firm truly valued long-standing relationships and was willing to invest in the kind of client-focused culture many larger companies had abandoned. Darius glanced at a fresh data report one evening and felt a thrill run through him as he saw the numbers spike, realizing that, in a sense, he was rebuilding the vision he once tried to nurture at Athenia, but now on his own terms, free from political sabotage or shallow corporate maneuvers. This was a new horizon indeed, and he reveled in the fact that real loyalty was being forged in an environment where no one needed to tear others down to climb higher. Though the memory of Athenia's betrayal lingered, it now served mainly as a reminder of what happens when an organization forgets the fundamental truth that business is, at its core, a tapestry of human connections. Here, in the clean, sunlit offices of Grantley, Darius was weaving a different tapestry threaded with respect, empowerment, and, ultimately, an extraordinary level of success that was as gratifying as it was richly deserved. Months passed under the banner of Grantley Associates, and the atmosphere around Darius McAllister felt electric, not only because his once-shaken confidence had returned in full force, but also because the firm's exponential growth had caught the attention of industry peers far beyond Riverfield City. That momentum propelled him to receive an invitation to speak at the upcoming Midwest Financial Summit, a prestigious annual gathering where senior executives, influential CEOs, and emerging entrepreneurs converged to discuss the evolving dynamics of financial services. Darius had attended similar events in the past, yet this time felt different, almost laden with the sense that fate was setting the stage for him to make a definitive statement, one that would resonate with everyone who had doubted him or sought to undermine him at Athenia Corp. On the morning of the conference, he walked into the grand foyer of the Riverfield Convention Center, flanked by two of his key colleagues from Grantley. Sunlight streamed through the glass atrium, illuminating the bustling crowd of attendees and casting an almost theatrical glow on the crisp banners, advertising panel topics like digital disruption and innovative funding strategies. Despite the clamor, Darius carried an uncanny composure as he made his way to the backstage area, pausing only briefly to greet a few familiar faces from the industry. He could sense the ripples of curiosity emanating from onlookers who remembered him as the account executive ousted by Athenia, and he offered polite nods, aware that rumors about his dramatic rebound at Grantley had already begun to circulate. There was a certain poetic justice in the fact that he now stood on the cusp of delivering a talk on client loyalty and long-term retention, the very principles that had been dismissed as outdated in his previous role. The conference hall was massive, capable of seating hundreds under vaulted ceilings, with rows of chairs stretching out toward a spacious stage illuminated by spotlights. When his introduction was announced, Darius stepped onto the platform and glanced at the attentive faces gazing back at him, some curious, some skeptical, and others simply hoping to glean strategies they could take back to their own firms. Seated near the front was a group of familiar figures executives from Athenia Corp, including their CEO, Elliot Sterling. It was a moment that could have triggered discomfort or anger, yet Darius felt only a measured calm, recalling the realization that he no longer needed to prove himself to those who had once undervalued him. Instead, he refocused on the reason he was there, to share a message he believed in, one that he had lived, breathed, and fought for. He began his talk by addressing the current climate of constant automation, aggressive cost-cutting, and the misguided notion that client relationships can be replaced by digital touchpoints alone. Without naming Athenia directly, he spoke of an unnamed organization that had once prided itself on innovation, but had tragically lost sight of the bedrock upon which all business truly stands: trust. He highlighted the real-world data Grantley Associates had amassed in a matter of months, revealing how consistent person-to-person connections not only safeguarded client satisfaction but also drove revenue growth in ways that no short-term tactic could match. His presentation slides included anonymized success stories, referencing accounts that had defected from companies prioritizing convenience over personal bonds, and demonstrating how quickly they flourished under an approach that embraced custom-tailored solutions and genuine care. Midway through his talk, the lights in the auditorium dimmed slightly, so the audience could better view a key slide projected behind him. A bar chart depicting client satisfaction spikes after a transition from a transaction-based model to one focused on sincere relationship building. Darius explained the intricacies of forging loyalty in a culture where everything is temporary, weaving in anecdotes of late-night calls he once took because a CFO panicked about a contract detail, or the times he flew cross-country on a moment's notice to finalize a deal in person. In the hush of the auditorium, one could almost hear people reevaluating their own company policies, wondering if they had unwittingly sacrificed loyalty for efficiency. He allowed the gravity of that realization to settle before pivoting to a finale that was as charged with emotion as it was with business acumen. He closed his speech by emphasizing that in a world addicted to the latest app or the newest data analytics tool, true loyalty remains a profoundly human endeavor. He spoke of how clients are not merely numbers on a spreadsheet, but real people with concerns, ambitions, and changing circumstances that demand empathy and adaptability from those who serve them. At this point, he paused, scanning the crowd until his gaze fell briefly on Elliot Sterling, whose expression was impossible to read. Then, with quiet assurance, he concluded that any firm that ignores the personal dimension of its client base does so at its own peril. The audience erupted into applause, some individuals even rising from their seats in a standing ovation, and Darius could sense a palpable shift in the room's energy. He was no longer just a cautionary tale of a high-performing executive cast aside by short-sighted leadership. He was now the embodiment of what companies could achieve when they placed enduring relationships at the core of their strategy. Following the session, attendees flooded the stage area, eager to ask questions and exchange business cards. Representatives from both established institutions and scrappy startups praised the clarity of his message, and several admitted they had grown tired of the endless drive for disruption that lacked any personal connection. Darius took time to engage with each person, listening to their perspectives, offering suggestions, and humbly acknowledging that he had learned these lessons the hard way. The swirl of conversation was suddenly punctuated by the tentative approach of an Athenia Corp board member, who hesitated before extending a hand and admitting they should have recognized the power of his philosophy sooner. Darius responded graciously, neither gloating nor downplaying the mistakes made, and simply reiterated that they still had a chance to pivot toward a client-centered ethos if they had the will to do so. That evening, as the conference's cocktail reception began, Darius found himself surrounded by a vibrant network of new contacts, old allies, and curious observers. The day's events felt like the pinnacle of a journey that started with betrayal but had led him to a place of vindication and influence. He smiled to himself, recalling how, not too long ago, he was packing his belongings into a cardboard box at Athenia's glass-walled office, uncertain about his future. Now, the only glass in his hand was a celebratory toast, clinking against those of colleagues and new friends, each exchange a fresh reminder that true business success is built on trust, authenticity, and a readiness to stand by one's convictions, even when it seems the entire corporate world might prefer a shallower, quicker route. In that moment, he felt a surge of gratitude for every wrong turn and closed door that had guided him here, fully aware that the real drama was not in how he had fallen, but in how decisively he had risen above those who believed he was replaceable. In the weeks following Darius McAllister's triumphant appearance at the Midwest Financial Summit, a shadow of anxiety fell across Athenia Corp's once impressive headquarters, its towering glass walls now reflecting an uncertain future rather than the bright promise they once symbolized. After the conference, rumors began swirling that Viridian Capital had formally withdrawn its offer to acquire the firm, leaving Athenia without its much-hyped buyout deal, and the board of directors was forced to confront the grim reality that the company had been gutted by the exodus of high-value clients. Under Brandon Elroy's questionable leadership, Athenia had sacrificed the very foundation of trust that had once fueled its rise. And, as those key accounts migrated to new providers, many of them heading straight to Darius at Grantley Associates, the financial pillars of the organization started to crumble at an alarming speed. Layoffs became inevitable, entire departments faced restructuring, and the atmosphere within the building grew tense and hushed, where even the busiest corridors felt like corridors of regret. Day by day, more accounts vanished, each departure serving as another bitter reminder of how badly Athenia had miscalculated in discarding Darius. Those in upper management scrambled to patch the rapidly expanding holes in the revenue stream, but hurried conference calls and discount offers did little to restore the faith of clients who had once believed they mattered on a personal level. Although Brandon Elroy had already been pushed out, his ghost lingered in the form of misguided policies and mistrustful clients. Analysts who had once praised Athenia for its dynamic ambition began releasing dire forecasts, painting a picture of a company in freefall. News outlets latched onto the story, running headlines about how a firm that had been a local powerhouse for nearly a decade was now teetering on the brink, undone by arrogance and a refusal to value the relationships that had kept it afloat. Amid this spiraling crisis, CEO Elliot Sterling found himself in the unenviable position of having to shoulder responsibility for a failure he had helped set into motion. While he publicly claimed that Athenia would bounce back stronger than ever, insiders whispered of emergency board meetings where Elliot's job security hung by a thread, and the possibility of shutting down entire divisions became a grim reality. Then came the day that truly signaled the end. Under cover of a drizzly morning sky, a team arrived with a crane and began carefully dismantling the massive Athenia Corp sign that had once loomed proudly over the entrance. Employees gazing out from high-rise windows watched in silence, a collective sense of shock gripping them as each letter was unceremoniously lowered to the ground. That symbol of corporate ambition, now a heap of twisted metal, seemed to embody the fate of a company that had forsaken its very soul in an attempt to package itself for a deal that never came. Around that same time, Darius received a neatly hand-addressed envelope from none other than Elliot Sterling. Inside was a short, handwritten letter in which Elliot apologized for orchestrating events that had forced Darius out, confessing that if he had truly understood the depth of Darius's connection to Athenia's clients, he might have made a different decision. Elliot wrote of realizing too late that by alienating the one person who held the key to their most important business relationships, they had effectively sealed their own downfall. The letter ended with a request for a face-to-face meeting. No lawyers, no board members, just us. Elliot pleaded, hoping for a moment of honesty and perhaps a small measure of absolution. Darius, reading those words in the quiet of his new corner office at Grantley Associates, felt an unexpected pang of empathy for a CEO trapped by his own missteps. Yet he could not ignore the raw betrayal that still lingered from the day he had been handed those termination papers, nor could he forget how swiftly Elliot had supported Brandon's campaign to undermine his contributions. Ultimately, Darius chose to respond with restraint, sending a polite message stating that he appreciated Elliot's gesture, but needed time to process what had happened before agreeing to any meeting. Truthfully, Darius had already moved on, pouring his energy into Grantley, where his new team thrived and his clients felt genuinely valued. Though the fall of Athenia echoed across the local business community, serving as a cautionary tale of what happens when personal connections are dismissed in favor of short-term schemes, Darius preferred to focus on the promise of a future free from the toxic politics that had once hampered his success. Even so, the image of that crane lifting away the last pieces of Athenia's name lingered in his thoughts, a potent reminder of how fleeting corporate power can be when it refuses to honor the human side of doing business. And in that quiet reflection, he found a sense of closure, knowing that sometimes the ultimate revenge is simply living well and refusing to let bitterness overshadow the new life he was building for himself. Segment 10. Lessons Learned and the Grand Finale. Darius becomes a partner. rediscovers family balance, and affirms human values beyond corporate profits. In the wake of Athenia Corp's collapse and his own meteoric rise at Grantley Associates, Darius McAllister found himself standing at a crossroads that felt entirely new, yet profoundly liberating. The firm's leadership had witnessed firsthand how his approach treating clients as more than just revenue figure had sparked unprecedented growth in a remarkably short span of time, and they wasted no opportunity in recognizing the driving force behind this cultural transformation. In a board meeting that was both celebratory and forward-looking, the partners formally offered Darius a seat at their highest table, inviting him to join as a true stakeholder in the company. Although he had dreamed of such recognition at Athenia, where titles often carried more shine than substance, this moment felt distinctly different because it carried genuine respect, not just for the profits he could generate, but for the integrity and empathy he brought to every deal. Shortly after signing the partnership papers, Darius returned to his new corner office, gazing out at the Riverfield city skyline that glistened in the late afternoon sun. He recalled the day he had been dismissed from Athenia, a single cardboard box containing nearly a decade of dedication, and he contrasted that memory with the sense of ownership he now felt. Here, he was not merely clinging to someone else's ladder of success, he was helping build the structure itself. However, perhaps the greatest difference was how this new level of responsibility also came with the freedom to construct policies that shielded future account executives from the very turmoil he had endured. True to his beliefs, one of his first moves as partner was to champion an employee profit-sharing scheme that rewarded long-term relationship building rather than punishing it. He wanted nobody at Grantley to ever lose faith in their contributions, the way he once had at Athenia, simply because corporate leadership took a misguided turn. Even as his professional star continued to ascend, Darius found new ways to restore balance at home. The late-night flights and constant phone calls that had once devoured his free time now gave way to a more reasoned schedule, one that included dinner with his family, cheering his daughter on at her dance recitals, and revisiting the traditions he had missed while relentlessly chasing deal after deal. When his phone did ring late in the evening, it was often a client who knew him well enough to say, "I'm so sorry. I hope I'm not interrupting family time," a testament to how he had successfully woven personal connection into the very fabric of his professional life. In those moments, he felt that elusive harmony between career and family, a balance that once seemed out of reach during his final years at Athenia. Although the path he had taken was anything but simple, the sense of fulfillment that now grounded him was infinitely more precious than the fleeting prestige he had once believed he needed. Amid the hustle of each new business quarter, Darius found himself increasingly reflecting on the moral core of his journey, realizing that his worth extended well beyond boardroom metrics. In staff meetings, he spoke passionately about how a person's character and the consistency of their word could outlast any short-term push for higher margins. He never denied the importance of profit after all. A thriving business depends on it, but he insisted that no monetary gain could replace the loyalty forged by genuinely caring about the human element of commerce. His colleagues at Grantley embraced this philosophy wholeheartedly, and together they cultivated an environment where collaboration flourished and clients felt not just supported, but truly understood. From time to time, he still received messages and emails from those who had once worked alongside him at Athenia. Some wrote to describe the bleak atmosphere left in the wake of the company's downfall, while others sought advice for forging their own path to a workplace that valued their skills and aspirations. Although he sympathized with their predicaments, he also recognized that his own story served as living proof of how adversity could be the catalyst for remarkable reinvention. If he had allowed bitterness to consume him, he might never have found the clarity and resilience that now defined him. And he took every opportunity to remind these former colleagues that they too could rebuild in a space that truly cherished their talents. As he reflected on the many twists and turns, Darius recognized that each chapter, his early struggles at Athenia, his shocking termination, and the subsequent rebirth at Grantley had coalesced into a living testament to the power of human bonds. Clients, co-workers, friends, and even family had stayed by his side or entered his life at crucial moments, forming the backbone of every success that followed. Although the wound of betrayal once ran deep, healing it had allowed him to evolve into a leader who could stand tall, both for himself and for those counting on him. In a sense, the best kind of revenge was not merely watching a negligent corporation falter, but rather moving forward to carve out something far greater and more authentic than anything he had ever known under Athenia's rigid hierarchy. Standing in his office late one evening, he glanced at a framed photograph on his desk, a snapshot of him and his wife at a recent charity gala hosted by Grantley Associates, taken mere months after he had stepped out of Athenia's shadow. Their smiles were genuine, unburdened by the doubt and strain that had once marked his life, and in that moment he felt a wave of gratitude for how far he had come. Without uttering a word, he closed the laptop that had dominated his world for so many years, switched off the overhead light, and left the building with a sense of purpose and fulfillment that was no longer tied to any single title or paycheck, but to the life he had built on his own terms. If you've been inspired by Darius's journey, his triumph over corporate betrayal, his commitment to authentic client relationships, and his pursuit of a balanced, fulfilling life, don't forget to subscribe and stay connected with us for more compelling stories. Join us as we continue to explore the depths of human resilience, the power of second chances, and the extraordinary outcomes that arise when we dare to value people over mere profits.